Hello, and welcome back to the Healthy and Happy podcast series. I am Dr. Slade, and I'm joined with a special guest today, Crystle Lampitt, and I'm super excited for our discussion today. Crystle is located in Kansas City, and has a background in news and media, and has transitioned into the field of mental health. And I think you guys are going to really enjoy her and our conversation today. I've already enjoyed the getting to know her a little bit. So welcome, Crystle.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. It is always nice to connect with other practitioners in other parts of the country with similar interests. So I can already tell, we've got a lot in common, talking about attachment and the importance of relationships and working with trauma and how all of these things really influence that capacity to be happy and healthy, right?
Yeah.
So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I recently just opened my own private practice. I am a therapist, like you said, in Kansas City, in the Kansas City Metro. And I did not start here. I was really passionate about documentary filmmaking for a long time. So I started off my career working behind the scenes, telling a lot of the stories of women. And there actually was a bit of a focus on trauma there as well, particularly sexual abuse. So I guess it wasn't a total left turn. I always enjoyed interviewing people and getting to know their stories, and that's always been a passion of mine. But then I transitioned to being in front of the camera, doing news reporting. I also hosted a morning show that was a really fun local lifestyle show. And I really enjoyed it for a long time, most of my 20s. I kept up with the pace pretty well. And then I got old.
You can't go there.
I got tired, more like it. And I did. I landed in the doctor's office. I was losing my hair. I was diagnosed with alopecia areata, which is where your hair falls out in clumps, so bald spots all over my head.
A little traumatic.
And yeah, a little scary to wake up to. And while it's not life-threatening, it was a wake-up call because I worked on TV every morning, so it was a little bit of well, how am I going to hide this now? And people can be judgy, so of course I was worried. Came later, found out I had 2 other autoimmune illnesses, knowing that once you have one autoimmune illness, you're prone to get some of the others. So I just started to realize my health was maybe on the line here. I felt okay for the most part. I was functioning, but I didn't feel as healthy as I probably could have been. And especially, this was happening, 24, 25.
Wow.
So I'm like, oh man, I'm too young for this, right? So I kind of did a deep dive when some of the interventions that I was trying, they helped, but I just felt like there was more going on. And I came to find through other people's amazing research, the link between really physical health and emotional and mental health, in particular, the relationship between PTSD or trauma and autoimmune illness. And so knowing that I had my own shock traumas and my own complex chronological, prolonged traumas, chronic traumas, I started to learn more about complex PTSD and was kind of blown away by the research there that, maybe this is at least part of why I'm not feeling as healthy as I should. So when I started to work on my mental health and my emotional health and my relationships, it was like magic. Not literally, but things, slowly and surely got better.
Yeah.
So my physical health has much improved, and it really led me to switch gears from television to go back to grad school when I turned 30 and just finished and opened my practice. And now I work with other people dealing with, trauma and with other mental health issues. So
I think that is such an important topic, and one that is largely either not understood at all or misunderstood by by most of us, and that is the link between our emotional and relational psychological health and our physical health. And so often people will spend so much time trying to fix the physical side of things and the physical symptoms without recognizing the contribution that emotional health and emotions are having on our physical health. And in particular, trauma of all kinds has such a negative effect on our physical health. And so I really, I think it's not a thing that a lot of people are understand well.
Yeah. It's definitely a burgeoning area of research. And while you can't always just straight up say, oh, correlation is not causation. However, we are just seeing more and more and more research in this area that trauma does impact the way that you feel every day. And it doesn't have to be PTSD, right? So you do not have to have a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis to be impacted by the effects of chronic distress and overwhelm on your nervous system. And so what I was experiencing as feeling really emotionally dysregulated, feeling triggered often, feeling confused, feeling too sensitive, those were the things that were really presenting in some of my relationships. When I kind of found later that it had a lot more to do with attachment trauma, shock traumas that I had experienced. And that was just really validating for me to see that it was there. I mean, it was there in the research. It wasn't just, my mind.
Right. You weren't making it up.
Yes. Yeah. So I wish more people knew that so they could feel validated in how the way that they feel. While of course you always want to get that medical treatment and medical attention, and you always want to get a diagnosis where it's appropriate. There's often other things going on that maybe it's worth being curious about, especially if you're feeling kind of off dated every day.
Yeah. Why don't you define shock trauma and attachment trauma for?
Yeah. So shock trauma is what we think of when we hear PTSD. And I don't love, so Francine Shapiro she created a method called EMDR for processing trauma. It's something that I really enjoy practicing, and I see it change some of my clients' lives. And she very early on kind of distinguished between big T and little t trauma. I try to be mindful of the way that I talk about trauma because I think, I never want to be minimizing or invalidating. However, I do think it makes a lot of sense when I say big T, meaning shock trauma. These are things that are usually one-time events or very infrequent, war, earthquake, a sexual assault, something that just shocks your system. Yep, exactly. Explosion, right? And then the little t trauma, what she calls little t trauma, or what we can think of sometimes as adverse childhood experiences, it's trauma that is chronic and prolonged and often attachment related. So thinking of it in terms of lifespan development, when you're so young and that brain is so fragile and so underdeveloped, and still in the process of creating all these new neural connections, we have to be extra attuned and extra gentle and extra caring with that brain. But if we're not, so let's say, you have some neglect in your family, you get dismissed often, you get minimized often, you can't talk about your feelings. It can be, of course, it can be the big trauma as well that happens in childhood. But it's the things, I think of little t trauma as being less visible. You might not see the wound. So the big T is kind of like the stab wound. The little t trauma, it's kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And they're both harmful. They're both incredibly harmful for that brain development and for just the way that we feel and the way that we function.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of times the attachment trauma and little t trauma. A lot of people don't validate that. Other people around will invalidate it, but all too often we don't validate it in ourselves also. And I'd like to swing back around to that in just a second, but I also want to kind of explore a little bit the why there's a relationship between trauma and our physical health. And one of the things that's important to understand there, I think, is that when we are emotionally flooded, and we get out of our windows of tolerance, is one of the ways that I talk about it. We are out of our frontal lobes, and our amygdala takes over, and there are so many processes. In fact, over 1,400 processes have been identified that happen physiologically when we become emotionally flooded, and in general. So your digestive system slows down or stops. Your reproductive system slows down or stops. Your immune system slows down or stops. Your blood pressure increases as your heart rate increases, and your vascular system narrows and hardens so that blood can be sent to the large muscle groups. Pupils dilate, frontal lobes are taken offline, cortisol is released, adrenaline is released. All of these things, capillaries in the lungs constrict so that blood pressure can increase. And so, but essentially all of that is anything that's non-essential for survival is slowed down and taken offline, and anything that is helpful for survival is ramped up. And that is a stressful state to be in. Yes. The research shows that it's actually a really effective state if you're facing a bear, or if somebody has pulled a knife on you, or when we are in actual danger and need to either fight or flee. But when our systems are in those elevated stress states for extended period of time, it's like an engine that is revving at 5,000 or 6,000 RPMs, and it just begins to wear on us and it creates all kinds of problems. So anyway, thoughts on that?
Yeah. And oh my goodness. Can I just record that little piece and just show that to all my clients? You explained it so beautifully. Exactly. And I use similar metaphors. It's like an engine just eventually wearing out and overheating and doing too much. And like you said, while it's really useful for if you're running away from a tiger, I probably do need to use those capabilities. However, living in survival mode, that's when it becomes that toxic stress, which we're just not meant to live there. We can handle it for short bursts of time. And depending on a number of factors, do you have unresolved trauma? What's the environment you're living in? What's the system you were raised in, micro and macro, looking at the messages you received growing up from your family, or your genetics, things that you don't have control over, up to what messages have you received culturally? How safe does your school feel? Do you have a sense of support in your community? Looking at every individual from a whole person systemic perspective makes it make more sense, because, even being able to name and understand the physiological responses that are happening, we also have to look at, okay, well, why? Why is this chronically getting triggered? And it's often a mixture of both. It's often a mixture of environment and also genetics. So it's often a mixture
nature
of
and nurture.
Nature and nurture, exactly. And so I like to start with, when I work with clients, is there something in your life that is like a house on fire? Because that's important. And if your house is on fire, you don't need 4-7-9 breathing. You don't need mindfulness. We need to put the fire out, because your system is responding as it should, and
exactly.
Can we trust? Exactly. Your brain is doing its job. It is keeping you alive. It is helping you avoid pain. It is doing exactly what it's designed to do. So if someone is living, for example, in an abusive relationship, in an abusive household, if they have systemic issues, which this is a bigger conversation, right? But living in poverty, not having what they need to truly feel safe and secure, Of course, they're going to be chronically stressed. Of course, they're going to constantly have that response happening inside of their bodies. So I like to start with, where is the house that's on fire? Is there something that needs to be done to put the fire out? And then we kind of move towards, as that capacity, as that window of tolerance increases, then we move towards, okay, now that you have some more resources, things feel a tiny bit more stabilized, hopefully, working on some of the internal processes of what needs to happen to help resolve this trauma, or to help resolve or support this pattern in shifting. But your brain can't be on fire for that to happen, right?
No, because literally when we are emotionally flooded, the frontal lobes are literally taken offline. If you look at the brain in those moments, blood is literally taken away from our frontal lobes, and our frontal lobes are the part of our brains that separate us from all other animal life, right?
Exactly.
We share our lower brain with reptiles and other mammals, and our frontal lobes are where reason and negotiation and delayed gratification and impulse control and all of those great things that make us humans. We literally lose access to all those capabilities when we are emotionally flooded.
Yeah. And isn't that wonderful that, it's like limbic versus logic, it's like, isn't it wonderful that if I'm being chased by a tiger, my limbic system goes, hey, you don't need to solve a math problem right now.
Exactly.
You need blood flow to go to your major muscle groups, to your heart, so you can get away from this tiger. It's brilliant. It's efficient. And it's so automatic. So sometimes the trouble with it is, again, of course, if we're living there chronically, that's exhausting. And also when I work with PTSD, for example, sometimes there's a lot of shame that comes with it, because we think, oh, well, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that instead? So particularly with sexual abuse, why did I freeze?
Right.
Why didn't I fight? Why didn't I do this? And if you understand that it's actually a brilliant response that your brain has, it is in milliseconds. It's deciding what is the safest bet here, to freeze, possibly, and if that's the case, I like to tell my clients, well, congratulations, your brain made the right choice, because you're here, you're sitting in front of me. So that's a sign that it's doing something right.
Yeah, it worked. And that's, and I think it's important to know that the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that is responsible to keep us safe, really only has 3 or 4 tools at its disposal. The first thing it goes to is fight or flight. Once we get up to the upper edge of our window of tolerance, it's sometimes referred to as the boiling point, then our brain's going to fight or flight. And if neither of those work, or if we don't have access to either of those, we crash right through the window of tolerance to the other end, to the freezing point, and our brains shut us down and we freeze. There's some new research that also says that fawning, real approval seeking and trying to placate,
people pleasing,
is another tool that the amygdala has at its disposal. But those fight, flight, or freeze are the only tools. It's like
that's it,
and a crescent wrench and a standard screwdriver, and that's all. So it will do one of those 3 things. So that's really good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's usually doing a brilliant job. We just don't recognize it, because we think, freezing, it's like, well, playing a possum. A possum plays dead, and you think, oh, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. And it doesn't judge itself for doing what it needs to do to survive a threat.
No.
But like you said, we have this part of our brain that goes, oh, well, what was I thinking? I could have done something else. And we have that self-talk that sometimes gets in the way of healing.
Yeah.
When you understand the physiology sometimes, and just how intelligent our brains really are, and how evolved and how creative they've become, I think it can take away a lot of that shame. So we can just start understanding, like, this is what I'm doing to keep myself safe, and I'm happy that exists.
Yeah. And the real key is we want the right part of our brain coping given what's going on. If we are in actual danger, we absolutely want the amygdala to be the part of the brain that's in control. However, if we're not in actual danger, then we do not want the amygdala to be the part of our brain doing the coping. And so as I work with people, that's one of the things that I try to help them to think through and recognize is, which part of my brain do I want to cope with this situation?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Yep. I like to use a kind of a scaling system for that. So if you use a scale of kind of, 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, whatever feels good for you. And for most people, I like to ask them to rate just, how activated are you in this moment? And if we roughly, this might be different for everyone, right? Roughly say anything a 6 or above, I'm pretty activated. I'm somewhere in my fight, flight, freeze response. My partner looked at me a certain way, and it reminds me of when I was a kid and my dad would disapprove of something and get really mad at me, and I'd get really upset because I'd feel judged and alone. So maybe you're at a 6. If you're at a 5 or below, you're probably somewhere in that parasympathetic rest and digest. Rest and digest is where we want to be. We can connect. We can have a nice conversation. We can share a meal, right? Digestion is online. It's a good
I,
place to be when you're having a serious conversation with your partner, for example. And so if you can even track where you are kind of day to day, moment to moment, and use that as a guiding tool for, okay, if I'm at a 6 or above and I need to talk to my partner about, I don't know, household chores that we've been having a lot of conflict about, my first job is to try to get back to a 5 or below through whatever resourcing or self-soothing activity I might need
love
before
that.
I bring that up. Otherwise, we're coming in hot with guns blazing. And we all already know how that conversation is going to go if you're at a 6, a 7, or an 8, versus if you're at a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you're in that place of connection where you can use things like I statements, right? Like,
Exactly.
yeah, hey,
Yeah.
honey, I need help with this, versus you never take out the
Right.
trash. Like, we just know
Right.
how that's going.
Yeah, and I really like that. That's a good, and there again, one of the biggest problems that happens when people are used to being in kind of a constant elevated state is that they don't know what's going on inside.
Mhm.
All of their senses are devoted to looking for danger
Mhm.
out there, and so they become very outward focused, and they become unaware of what level they are or what's going on internally. And so just it's a super effective intervention and tool to take time just to begin to notice, oh, this is what it feels like when I'm at a 3. Oh,
Mhm.
this is the way my system feels when I'm at a 5. Okay, when I'm starting to feel these things, that means I need to do something to re-regulate, and to
Yeah.
get reorganized. And so just learning to pay attention to those internal signals is super powerful.
Yeah. And it's a skill and it's a practice, right? Depending on where you're at. Again, it's more effective sometimes rather than others, but it's even the act of doing that, of that reflection, putting words to it, oh, I'm at a 7. I'm feeling
Yeah.
really upset. I'm frustrated because so-and-so said this about me at work. Even that begins to bring back the logic brain online, because you're using your word processing, you're identifying what's happening, you're externalizing it, you're getting out of your head a little bit. And even that, sometimes just naming it makes it feel a little bit less heavy and intense. And then you
It
also get a
activates the
clue.
brain. Yeah.
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 And you can kind of move forward with, okay, what do I need? Do I need to call a friend? Do I need some support? Do I need to take a hot bath? Do I need to go for a jog? Just getting really in tune with what's happening in your body and what's happening in your nervous system, which sounds easy, but it's not. It's just, especially if you're not used to it,
It does
or
sound
where
doesn't
it
it? Yeah.
sounds simple, right? But, and especially if your trauma is related to minimizing how you're feeling, and dismissing and ignoring and bypassing. I don't know how many people I work with, and I'm including myself in this, who aren't even aware of when they need to use the restroom or hunger cues,
Right.
and I
So
remember feeling that way sometimes, just work, and no time. And I mean, I just got so used to bypassing those signals that you can imagine how over time it kind of leads to you downplaying yourself, bypassing
absolutely.
yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you've been trained in NARM.
Yes.
Um, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so NARM is a newer modality. It stands for the neuroaffective relational model. So it was created by Lawrence Heller. It came somewhat out of some of the concepts of somatic experiencing, which is another form of therapy. So it uses a lot of the latest research in brain science, neuroscience, also factors in attachment, and then of course affect, right? So mood. How do these things all play into each other, and how does this affect the way that you feel day to day and the way that you relate to yourself and to others? So it's one of my favorite tools. It is complex and layered, and
As is trauma.
as is trauma. Exactly. And I think one of my favorite things about this method is, again, looking at the whole person, right? So we're looking at, yes, what's happening in your brain, also what's happening in your relationships and in your world and in your community, that has caused you to develop what they call adaptive survival strategies. So the way that NARM really holds some of our pesky patterns, if you will. So for example, maybe I have perfectionist parts, right? That like to come out when I'm, I don't know, hosting a get together, a Friendsgiving or a Christmas party. And I get really angsty about everything being perfect. When really, if I was getting in touch with my highest self, if you will, or my logic self, my adult self, my intention for the night is probably just to connect with my friends, right? And to connect with my family. And then, but this perfectionist part, this really activated part gets in the way of me being able to do that. NARM would call that in some ways part of it, sometimes an adaptive survival strategy. So how has perfectionism, achieving, even things like addiction, compulsive behaviors, how have these patterns often made sense and served us if we understand the full context? Because we don't just like randomly wake up deciding I'm going to be a perfectionist from here on out, or I'm going to get addicted to various substances and just, lose all sorts of things because I feel like it.
It'd be a great path.
I feel like I'm just going to do that today.
Yeah.
We don't just wake up one day with these patterns. They're often sneaky, and they're kind of pervasive, and they've often started a long time ago, often before we even have that capacity for explicit memory. And so perfectionism, if, for example, it's related to, when I'm perfect, that's when my parents paid the most attention to me because I got perfect grades and I got lots of praise and my teachers loved me. And this was the thing that got me love, which of course my brain is going to love equals survival, right? When you're 6, it really does. And so thinking of what has caused these patterns to generate and what is holding them in place, and how are they helpful and how are they at times getting in the way of what you really want for yourselves. So sometimes, the way I like to think of it is not so much that we want to banish it, even, and you might want to, I know many people who are like, I wish I could just, never compulsively shop ever again. And I hate this part of myself. And, I get it, of course.
Absolutely, yeah.
What I like to focus on rather than that is more, how can we increase the intentionality with which we choose to use this strategy or this strategy? So kind of what you were saying earlier about, we want to make sure it's like the right part of the brain that's online. Do I want to go in guns blazing with my partner, like the same energy I would use to run away from a tiger? Maybe not, probably want to use this other part of my brain. So if we can increase the intentionality, the agency, that sense of choice, that often helps us feel a lot better, because we're applying sort of, okay, so a part of me really wants to compulsively shop to avoid this difficult feeling or this difficult situation, and I could, I could probably do that. And as we increase safety, as we increase understanding and curiosity and compassion, and also expand that window of tolerance, often new choices become available. So we might decide, I could compulsively shop. I can do that. And it might serve me better to do this other thing, or even, like a lower, I like to do damage control, like go to the Dollar Tree,
Right. Right.
something else. but we've increased the agency there. And that's really what NARM focuses on, is can we identify what your adaptive survival strategies are? How are they serving you? How are they not? And how can we increase your capacity to choose, and to bring that agency online? And usually there's many reasons why these patterns have become what they are, right? So that's kind of a case by case basis. But it's a really cool method. And it incorporates a lot of the attachment research that we have as well. Because, many of these patterns start with those early attachment relationships.
Yeah. It wouldn't be a Healthy and Happy podcast if we didn't get to attachment a little bit here.
Right. Of course. Yes.
You talked about a couple of things that I really want to kind of highlight. And one is the fact that 80% of the brain gets wired by age 3. And most people have no explicit memory or conscious memory before 3 or 4. If you stop and say, okay, what's my first memory, my first earliest memory? For most people, that's somewhere around 3 or 4, which means that 80 and 90% of the brain is wired by age 5. So 80 to 90% of our brains are wired before we have any conscious thought. And one of the real side effects of that is that so many of the things that we just completely take for granted were wired in before we had any say in the matter. They were wired for us. And so many of us don't ever stop to think, or to question them, do I want to think that? Do I really want to feel that way? Do I really want to cope that way? And we just take it as a given because it's literally all we've ever consciously known. And so just by understanding that fact is empowering to say, okay, well, yeah, maybe I don't want to keep these things. Because the cool thing about the brain is while it is very stable, it is also plastic. And we literally have the ability to rewire our brains if we will rewire them. I guess the good and the bad is that most of us don't.
Sure. Yeah.
But so I think that's a really good point. And I think another really great point that you mentioned is that just taking a moment and the holidays, I think this podcast will probably air before Christmas. If not, you can think about the holidays past. But it's a really, if you can just take a moment before you go into an event and say, okay, what is my intention for this event? What a easy question and what a powerful tool to say, oh, well, yeah, I actually threw this party because I really wanted to connect with my family, or I really wanted to connect with my friends. Totally different than making sure that every centerpiece is just right, or that the gravy is perfect, or whatever else, right? And so I really, really like that. That's not a tool that I've used or thought of, and it's a super powerful one.
Yeah, so I do love that one around the holidays. If we can kind of change how we define the benchmark of what's going to make this successful, what is successful for me, and if we can change the framework from, my perfectionist part might think everything being perfect is what makes this evening successful. The other parts of me, like I said, my adult self, the higher selves, or the higher parts of me that are aware of my values, that really know what's important to me. They would probably say, that part of me would probably say connection. I want to connect with my friends. I want to catch up with people. So what's going to support me in doing that? And that might be, recruiting some help. It might be saying, hey, you're in charge of the gravy,
right.
You're the bartender,
or we're gonna have the party someplace else.
Or we're going out to eat. Or exactly. And if we can do that and take a moment, I even like to go for kind of very reasonable expectations, really managing those expectations around like, hey, if I'm working out of perfectionism, for example, and I really want to focus on connection, if I notice during this one evening that I spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes, not worrying about the gravy, and I spend 20 to 30 minutes having an amazing conversation with this friend that I've really been dying to catch up with for a long time. If I can make that my benchmark for success, it shifts a lot of the pressure that we put on ourselves to do things a certain way. And what that does is it also then reinforces this neural pathway in the brain, right? That says, I don't have to be a perfectionist. That says, I can absolutely totally tolerate things not being perfect. The world will not explode. I will actually feel better because I know. I mean, you'll have to talk to my perfectionist parts about that one.
Right. Don't go too
yeah. Noticing a little discomfort, just naming that, right? But if we can start with those baby steps, for people with social anxiety, for example, if I'm working with someone who believes I can't make friends, everyone's always judging me, I can't tolerate this. The benchmark for them might be spending 5 minutes talking to someone that they don't normally talk to. And if they do that, and we call that a win and we call that a success, it kind of helps to reframe what makes it a good time for you and a successful experience for you. And then we also give the brain the new evidence that it needs to learn, oh, I can tolerate discomfort. I can tolerate imperfection. I actually am a great conversationalist. I talked to that person for 10 minutes. I blew my goal out of the water. So if we can just start really small and create baby steps, it's both an external and an internal process. We want to learn what's happening internally, and we want to practice some skills externally too, where it feels accessible and within your window of tolerance, and to be able to reframe, what feels most aligned for me. And then we celebrate that, we celebrate that you spent 5 minutes doing something out of your comfort zone. And we let the brain know, hey, you're safe, you're good, you got this.
Yeah. Really excellent. And a couple other really good points I want to highlight there. One is the whole parts concept. There's a theory of human development and therapy that's internal family systems theory.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire, the crux of the model is that there are different parts of us that just like a family or any other system functions, there are different parts of us that have different agendas, different priorities, that are vying for different things. And what's that show? Inside Out.
Oh yes, I love that movie. It's such a good one. It's a great explanation of some of the different parts you might have too.
It really is. And just recognizing, there is part of me that really is perfectionistic, or there's part of me that really wants to, be selfish, or there's part of me that really, is driven by shame or whatever. Recognizing and naming those parts really empowers the executive part of our brain to be able to decide which of those parts is going to get the reins, right? Which of those parts is going to be in control. And I think that's really powerful. The other thing that you said too, that I want to highlight is the whole emotional regulation. Most of what we do as human beings, we do trying to regulate our emotions. Mm-hmm. And we do the things that we think are going to help us feel the ways that we want to feel. And we don't do the things that we think are going to make us feel ways that we don't want to feel. Mm-hmm. And so recognizing that by taking some of these steps to set up a situation, we can be ahead of the game. And then also just the importance of healthy functioning relationships and attachment relationships. One of the things that, there are mountains of research and literature on attachment theory at this point. And one of the most fascinating things to me about that research is that there is nothing that works more effectively to help us regulate our emotions than a healthy attachment relationship. A healthy, secure base, not exercise, not distraction, not square breathing. There is nothing that helps us get reorganized to go from a disorganized state to an emotionally organized state than a secure base. When we have somebody that we feel safe going to, and that we're willing to go to, so we've got to be willing to turn when we should be turning. And then we've got to have somebody that consistently shows up by being available and sensitive to us in those attachment moments. It helps us regulate our emotions more effectively than anything else.
Absolutely. I cannot speak to that enough, especially being in kind of an epidemic of loneliness right now, where a lot of us do feel very alone, even with, even connected digitally, but really disconnected in a lot of ways. Just the importance of social support. In fact, yes, the research on attachment it's pretty clear at this point. And when I was, researching PTSD and just seeing all of the studies coming up about how one of the greatest protective factors from developing PTSD, it's not a medication, it's not your grit and your resilience and your brain, and it's actually social support. And they really researched how people can go through some really significant traumatic experiences, but they often will not develop the symptoms of PTSD if they have a strong support system.
Yeah.
So that's huge. And just knowing kind of how relationships can really make or break your health too, right? Because the flip side of that is also true. When you have those injuries, those attachment injuries from unhealthy relationships, toxic or abusive relationships, the amount of distrust and dysregulation that causes in the nervous system, because it truly is, we're looking to people as a survival resource. And now this relationship that is really pro my survival has also become threatening. Working through that I can't trust anyone cognition that often comes with trauma is one of the trickiest, because really people are surviving things they should not have had to go through. And that's where sometimes actually I like to really work with obviously the modalities that I use, EMDR, NARM, and some of the things I do in therapy, but the therapeutic relationship is huge. We know that the therapeutic alliance is often one of the biggest predicting factors in the success of your treatment is, do you feel safe with your therapist? Yeah. And then I like to encourage people to create safety with whatever feels resourcing for them. So it might not be a person right off the bat. That's why we have therapy dogs. That's why we have equine therapy. And I kind of jokingly say, but I'm not really joking. Like, I don't really care if you first find safety and security with a hamster or a tree or a frog or a cat, whatever.
Start where you are.
Start where you are and just notice what it feels like to be able to trust another living being. Yeah. And even that, it's a baby step, right? And we're giving the brain evidence like, hey, not everything is terrible and scary. And hopefully most people, not everyone, unfortunately, hopefully most people, as they review their life histories, they can land on a teacher, a coach, a role model, even a celebrity, that they really look up to, a sports figure, that they can go, I want to be like that person, or they seem cool. They seem like they would be a really loving, attuned person. And so sometimes that's where we're starting, and that's okay too. But yeah, it just goes to show how resourceful our brains can be, because from there we can grow into those healthier relationships as well. And we can, again, rewire the brain. We can develop a secure base if we do the work.
Yeah, really, really, really great. Well, Crystle, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed talking to you. And I, if you're willing, I might have to have you come back and talk some more.
Sure.
It's been a really fun thing. And I, and I'll ask you your closing thoughts here in just a second, but I just, as we kind of wrap this up, what I would really hope that those of you that are listening get out of this is hope. Recognition and hope. For those of you that might be struggling with some autoimmune issues or other physical ailments, and feel kind of baffled at what's going on, I would really encourage you to look at the emotional things that have happened in your life and the emotional and psychological and relational components that might be contributing to some of your physical symptoms and challenges. And then just know that the science is really clear that there's always something that can be done. There are very, very few things that just are, even physically. And if you and Crystle's a great example. She very proactively did something and took some pretty major steps in her life to take control over what was going on. And you're a great example of a success story, not only personally, but now you're helping other people be able to do that as well. And so I would just encourage you to be courageous and to take steps. Again, start wherever you are. You don't have to go from 5 to 95. You just start where you are and take steps and get help and and you can absolutely move your way towards being more healthy and happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. No, it's been wonderful chatting, and I hope the same, that people will walk away with a sense of hope, and hopefully a sense of self-compassion for just themselves, and maybe even a little bit of awe in how much they've survived already and how much their brain has taken care of themselves already. I think people are surprised when they realize, like, I've kind of had my back this whole time.
Yes.
I've survived 100%
Yeah.
of my bad days thus far. And that's important
Love
to remember when things are really bad, when things are really, really bad. And of course, some people are going to have more resources than others. I always like to include the limitations that we have systemically. That's a larger conversation around who gets access to what.
Right.
And I do hope that word that you use, being proactive, accessing whatever you can. I know for me, before I really started my mental health journey and changed careers and made the big leaps, right? I started really small with books, with free research journals, with free support groups, with workshops that I could access. And honestly, even I think taking away from this conversation, social support, that can be therapeutic. You do not have to go to therapy. You do not have to do any of these things. You can start exactly where you are. And even if it's a role model or something that just makes you feel a little bit more human and a little bit more like yourself, connected, exactly. That can be a huge step. So I do hope that, we'll continue working through the systemic issues that we have and make some of these methods and some of this information more accessible. And in the meantime, there is a wealth of information out there. And I hope that if you feel that it is accessible right now, that you do look out for possible solutions. I know I like to share on my Instagram. I'm not as active as I could be right now, but I do share some.
Got married. That's probably partly.
I did. That was part of the journey, right? But I'd like to share, and there's, oh my God, there's so many. But my Instagram handle, if you would like to check.
Yes, I was going to ask you that.
Yes.
How do people find you?
Yes. So I'm usually active on Instagram. It's at CrystleLampitt. So at Crystle Lampitt. My website is clwellnesskc.com. I do actually have a book list on my website that I think can be really helpful. Some of the books that I've really enjoyed that supported me a lot and that I recommend to some of my clients. And yeah, I mean, there is a wealth of information out there. So feel free to reach out if you have questions. I do love sharing what I'm learning, and I do like to support people however I can. So
that's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.